Hi, I'm Jason Renaud with the Oregon Housing Conference, and now we're speaking with Gale Holland, reporter with the Los Angeles Times. How are you doing today, Gale?
Very good, thank you.
Thanks for coming and speaking with us about what you've seen on the streets of Los Angeles. So COVID gets started in China in February, and when do you see the first signs of it in Los Angeles?
Well, we had one of the first cases in February. Not among the homeless people, of course, a traveler.
And consciousness about homelessness starts to get into the public health system and to people who advocate for the homeless fairly soon?
Yes.
What did you see as the first steps that were taken?
One of the first steps that was taken was trailers were brought in for isolation and quarantine. And this I think would be step two. There was street testing, and it began in Skid Row and Venice, which are they're two of the largest homeless populations in Los Angeles, but they're also relatively centralized. So the testing people would come for the testing theoretically. But actually in Venice, I understood that the homeless people were not interested in being tested. In Skid Row, they were more interested, but not necessarily with the initial city effort to test because there was a police presence.
I see. So the people felt that they might have some jeopardy if they got tested.
Well, I think they didn't want to be arrested. And, many people in the homeless people who live in those two parts of Los Angeles tend to have had brushes with the police because there's been very aggressive police action over time.
Gail, you're speaking to people who are all over the country. Could you just spend a moment telling us about the scale of homelessness in Los Angeles? We've all heard a little bit, but tell us from your perspective.
Right. Well, there's 66,000 homeless people in L.A. County, and 70% of them or more, it vacillates every count, live outside. So it's a very visible problem as opposed to, there's 10 million people in L.A. County. So 66,000 is terrible, awful, obviously, but proportionately, it may not be. I know it's not per capita the largest population, but it's probably the most visible. And there are concentrations in different parts of LA that are pretty well known, i.e. Skid Row, Hollywood, and Venice Beach. And of course, Venice Beach is the #1 tourist draw in Los Angeles. So a lot of people have seen the homeless people there. And Hollywood, same thing. So the consternation has always been the visibility of the homeless as opposed to the numbers, I'd say, really. And the other problem being that the living outdoors is very bad for people's health in general. And I wanted to throw this in there because a lot of people don't know this. Every year, people die of the cold and the heat in Los Angeles who are living on the street. Because I think a lot of people, you hear in the general public, well, the reason LA has so many homeless people is because there is no threat from weather. Well, there's a double threat from the weather. So the fear, of course, was that it was going to be a tremendous problem with all the people outside. But at least to date, the belief is that is not the case. And there's been a lot of interesting studies that pertain to it and exploration by public health experts as to why that has not happened, which I could go into if you're interested.
Yeah, well, it's in general that there's a better social distancing when people are away from each other.
Yeah, and just outdoors, just the ventilation. And I think everybody agrees on that. Something that was originally thought to be very speculative, but they're now leaning towards, or at least they're looking into it, is the idea that people who have had a lot of other coronaviruses may have retained some kind of resistance. And they're thinking that's why daycare centers are not having outbreaks, because the kids, and that was something that was brought up to me early on when I did a story about are the homeless people actually going to dodge the heavy hit that had been anticipated? And then, of course, there's all kinds of, as I'm sure everybody at this conference knows, there's all kinds of problems with really relying on the data. And the excess mortality rates are way up. But the latest thing I saw is that they don't think that's COVID related. They think it's probably more related to just an overall lack of people seeking or receiving health care. But certainly in Los Angeles, probably, at least compared to other people, I don't know if it's ideal, there's a lot of street medicine and street emergency teams out there with testing, with PPE, with food. So
it sounds like resources got to the street pretty quickly.
Yes, I think they did. And because they already, I mean, the Los Angeles homeless situation was already considered such a crisis. There was already extra money for homelessness that hadn't been available coming in from the state because we got a new governor who made it more of a priority. Gavin Newsom, the former mayor of San Francisco. So his closeness to the issue was greater. He'd been dealing with it for a long time as mayor. So, and then Los Angeles has innovated, and one of the programs, Housing for Health, is they redirected health dollars directly to housing for homeless people. And they also had a system of shelter inspectors. So they already had that going. So they were able to go in, and I think decompression is a word that's used nationally, correct, for shelters? Okay, anyway, so go into the shelters. They already knew who was in there and what the conditions were, and they were able to very quickly institute the social distancing, cleaning, hygiene checks, temperature checks, and all this, some of which, of course, have now proven to be, I don't know if you'd call them overkill, but I think temperature checks are not seen as valuable as they were at one point. And even the deep cleaning is not seen as valuable. And I know that one of the things that impressed me at a shelter I went to recently was that they had the plexiglass dividing all the dining tables. And then I read that after the plexiglass went up for I believe it was the vice presidential or presidential debate, that they've now decided the plexiglass is pointless.
Huh.
So there's a lot of wheel spinning, but as we all know, we're all doing that.
Sure.
None of us really know.
Every grocery store in America sold out of bleach and antiseptic hand cleaner for a few.
Right.
Yeah. And now we're seeing that I'm trying to get rid of all the bleach that I acquired. So it sounds like there was a process of addressing homelessness in a serious way in Los Angeles in multiple communities long before this pandemic hit you.
Yes. I mean, there was an effort. I don't think anybody is happy with the results. I mean, the 66,000 was a 13% rise from the year before. And the efforts, these more innovative efforts they're very celebrated in Washington, have been going on for years. Yeah. They're also, I mean, the voters, approved a relatively massive more than $1 billion of supportive housing construction, and that largely has not come online. But the point is, there have been a lot of efforts, and the results are not what had been hoped.
Let me ask about people who are homeless who have untreated mental illness and untreated addiction. How are those really difficult to serve communities faring at this point.
Well, as far as, LA also later, not in the beginning, did a program, which I'm sure other people did too, called Project Room Key, that was a hotel program. And in the beginning, the city and county are pretty much on a housing first, harm reduction footing. So in the beginning, they had no segregation, but they quickly realized that they did have to come up with something. So in some cases, though, they have already existing shelters that have 24-hour mental health staff. They have mental health housing that they were able to place some people. And it wasn't just mental health and substance abuse. There was all kinds of quote unquote high acuity medical problems for the people they were bringing inside. So they just set aside beds in some of the hotels. And in one case, they set up an entire hotel. And as far as in isolation, again, because the numbers were not that great, they never actually filled all the quarantine and isolation spaces that they originally had set aside, which were in trailers and hotels. And so,
off the top of your head, do you know some of the numbers of Project Room Key, the number of rooms that were leased?
well, there were over 4,000, and they believe that 5,780 people, because I just looked at this, went through the program. And they're making they haven't closed all of them. They are slowly closing them. I know that they want to put them in housing, obviously, and they have a plan in California. They have more funding for something called Project Home Key. There was a tremendous rapid rehousing effort. I don't have the numbers on it though. But so that's part of it. But they are also putting people in shelters. And I know one of the biggest shelters opened a warehouse just for some of the people from Project Room Key.
Did you see mental health or addiction health services close or shutter their doors for some duration of time?
No.
They were able to stay open throughout?
Not that I know of.
Okay, great. Let me ask.
But I want to add that that's not something I particularly covered. I know they also set up one hotel just for domestic violence, and that was 100 rooms. So also at the same time that the homeless efforts were going on, Los Angeles has correspondingly in pretty much in startup mode, diversion and reentry programs. And those continued. So some of those were obviously had capacity for and are handling substance abuse and mental illness, because that's a large part of our prison population, or our jail population anyway, but our prison population as well. So
complicated by the criminality as well as the mental illness and addiction. Tell me a little bit, you use this word billions, which is unique to Los Angeles in American cities' approach to homelessness. Tell me a little bit about the money that's involved here.
Well, I don't really have a handle on the money. We're still trying to figure it out. But we got hundreds of millions of, all these different programs had different funding sources. We had hundreds of millions of dollars before it happened, in addition to what we had originally had, which was about 200 million a year. And that's for the LA, LA has this weird thing of one of their continuums of care is called LA City and County. But then there are other continuums of care within the county that are separate for others. So the CARES money, they say that they dedicated more CARES money to homeless than most people did. But that, I think, is really unclear what they actually spent and what they spent it on. But just to go back to the hotels for a second, they graduated from Project Room Key to Project Home Key. And they have done one very specific thing they did is the city of Los Angeles is buying, now I'm forgetting the exact numbers, I wrote it down here. they're buying like 100. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to pull it right out here, but they're spending up to 100. It's around 100 million that they're spending to buy 10 motels that are going to house 536 people. And they're going to buy the motels and convert them into efficiencies. So that's one thing they're doing. They're also talking about pallet huts or whatever. And I believe you have those in Oregon, correct? And I don't know what, they haven't opened them yet. So that's a city, that's something coming from, well, just politically, the city council president, who's very important in Los Angeles, was more of a supporter of the whole permanent housing, and he had a majority. And the new city council president is a lot more has more interest than he had anyway in more temporary housing solutions and getting people off faster. And the feeling is they had their chance because we've had this bond money that was the voters approved that was $1 billion for 4 years. And people are getting very impatient about that. And of course, exacerbating that is that there was a moratorium on outdoor camp sweeps. So the visibility has only gone up during COVID. Yeah. Whether the numbers have gone up or not, we don't know.
Were you able to maintain that moratorium on sweeps?
Yeah, but they're lifting it. They actually partially lifted it earlier. The county is largely not doing sweeps, but they also, there was formation of mega camps. There was one camp right on the border. Excuse me, I'm going to have to cough. There was one camp right on the border of Santa Monica that was along a golf course that was more than 100 people. And there were fires, and the neighbors were felt extremely impinged upon by the camp. Mm-hmm. And so they broke that up. There was another 100-person camp in Pacoima, which is a poor, historically Black, but now Latino neighborhood. And they actually got all of them into rapid rehousing. They actually did an experiment of housing them together because they were a displaced Black community that had ended up being pushed around this town of this suburb of Pacoima, but were staying together. So, excuse me, they're experimenting on that with how successful it is if you're able to keep a street community together, which is not something that LA has done too much. So they did break up some massive camps that had problems. They moved camps with the fires that California has experienced. They've moved camps that were out of the hillsides, of which there are many. Because Los Angeles County, most people probably know this, is really vast and has a huge canyon system. Like there are canyons everywhere that, leading out of the central city, there are many, many canyons and many old camps, 30-year camps. Obviously, it's not the same people.
But the camps have sort of a culture and a way of dealing with neighbors.
To move into the canyons?
Well, I'm just asking that if you break these up, you're also breaking up a community.
Yeah, in some cases. But again, they've made an effort to move them all to similar places, or in the case of Pacoima, they literally moved them to the same hotel. And that one has, I don't believe, the outcome of those people where they were able to place them. But basically, permanent housing placement has not really gotten that much better. Obviously, they're placing people all the time, but.
Let me ask some questions about reporting on homelessness. That's your beat. And also the politics of homelessness in Los Angeles, because this is super complicated and difficult for us to understand. the Los Angeles Times, you have a full-time homelessness reporter, you, and how did you get here and did you select this beat?
No, I didn't. I had been writing a column, and I proposed writing about the 1%. And my editor said he had noticed, because he was a biker, a bike rider, a cyclist, not a motorcyclist. And he had noticed the buildup along the bike paths and the canyons and everything. And so he said, why don't you do this? But I have really, really liked it. And I think it's really important. But one problem I had, if you're asking about me as a reporter, is I do have both the age and the health condition vulnerability. So I largely quit going out and discovered that that's the part I like about it. I like meeting the people, and I also really prefer getting my ideas from the ground up and not the city or county down.
And now that it's all telephone, and how are you doing as in collecting your story?
Well, that's the whole problem. I haven't been doing street reporting, but we have other reporters doing it. Mm-hmm. So I've been editing. I mean, a lot of us our organization has been over backwards to help those who are vulnerable, and just everyone, because if you're not medically vulnerable, you have kids in your home, or you have parents that you're helping to take care of. So they've been over backwards to try to help us not be at risk.
That's great.
But I actually now regret, I wish that when our numbers were down, because the homeless people, I just don't feel they're a big risk.
So talk to me a little bit about the politics of homelessness in Los Angeles. This is a big issue every day down at City Hall.
And in the county. This is the number one issue, partly because we have probably the most liberal city council and county board of supervisors that LA has ever had. Mm-hmm. There's the representation by conservatives is pretty low. So, but it's also the magnitude of the problem has pushed it to the front. And I think for at least 2 years running, everybody's agreed it's the number one issue. And it went from being not an issue at all, like in polling, like not even on the top 10, to being number one. So that explains partly why the state started giving us money and everybody decided the status quo was not adequate. We had propositions that passed overwhelmingly to fund, one is a sales tax, one is a bond measure, to fund $1.2 billion of supportive housing, with the services being funded by the sales tax. There was a strong push towards housing first and harm reduction, which had been resisted. And at least officially, there was a turning away from a law enforcement approach, but that seems to yo-yo back and forth. Mm-hmm. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the politics are complicated because there's also a tremendous problem of people living in substandard, overcrowded conditions. And there is a racial element to the politics because I believe that the Black proportion, the proportion of people experiencing homelessness in LA City anyway, and county, I think, who are Black is usually between 30 and 35%. And the Latino portion is growing, but a lot of the overcrowded substandard housing falls on Latino people. And there is a move now to help those people. And so they're not officially the homeless people that HUD counts. They're the people in garages and other substandard things. So the city council is moving some of the money that under the old regime might have gone to the HUD defined homeless people, to those people, and to the children who the school district, of course, defines as homeless. So that's part of the politics. And I think that another unique thing that's going on here is, I think we all know here on the West Coast about the Ninth Circuit decision that says you can't remove people, or you shouldn't remove people from camps unless you have a shelter to put them into, which obviously the COVID gave another reason to follow that precept, because the outbreaks that we have had have been in shelters, the largest shelters. But then there was separately a downtown business group filed suit about the street homeless problem, basically. They had various causes of action. And the judge has become very activist on this. And one of his edicts is to remove everybody who is all the camps that are near or under freeway overpasses. And I'd say status quo homeless service community thinks this is a big mistake, among other things, because they struggled for a long time to prioritize and have invested lots of money. And this, of course, came from the federal government in identifying the most vulnerable and prioritizing them for homelessness. And the people under the freeways tend not to be those people. And there's also the question of, like I said, there's a handful of hypo and hyper. So in other words, dying from the cold and the heat every year now. And the freeway overpasses are the only protection from that in Los Angeles. And it does rain here, and it does get cold at night, and it does get very, very hot in the summer. So there's a real push-pull going on, and people are trying, the status quo homeless service industry is trying to come up with plans to accommodate both the judge's desires and their own priorities. And that's a big part of the politics, because in this fight in court, the city and county fell out with each other. And before, they had been pretty unified in what they wanted to do.
So with all these money and all this political willpower and all this interest on the part of the people, do you see the numbers going down for people who are unsheltered and homeless in Los Angeles anytime soon?
No, because the housing is not coming online. I mean, but every year they tell us this is the year where you're going to see the impact of the housing. I think there's been a lot of false starts. I mean, this buying of the motels, they first brought that up years ago. Safe parking years ago. Everything was introduced 4 to 5 years ago. And again, it's not been done in any scale. And for example, safe camping, the only person doing safe camping is the Veteran Administration. And they have a really lovely 487 acre campus.
That's about the right size.
Excuse me, that has been fought over for decades. And because they had buildings on there, it was dedicated as a soldier's home, but they let the buildings go to pot and nobody really lived there anymore, very small programs. And there was a lawsuit, and now they have a plan, but again, it's moving at a glacial to build 1,500, like a 1,500 unit village with all kinds of state of the art, like job programs and recreation and all of this. And so that's underway. But meantime, the VA got, again, a change of leadership, and they opened a 50-person safe camping site. And apparently it's incredibly successful. But there's in moving people through, because the city has opened a lot of shelters, but they're not moving people anywhere with them. They're either staying there or they're back in the street. But the city and county looked into the VA program and found that the services that they feel are creating that success are services that only the VA can fund, because they've got them right there on campus, all the clinical services. And for the city or county to replicate this would be too expensive.
Yeah, I have not actually heard a new idea about solving homelessness in a dozen years. So we do hear the idea recycling problem, and it does seem that the people who are winning this are the property developers. So,
the property developers?
As they're building all this housing.
Oh, you mean they're the ones who are profiting?
No.
It's not. Well, yeah, I mean, the sad thing, and I don't know if everybody says this, but I don't know how many times privately those of us who care about, not service providers, they're too careful, but reporters have said, well, maybe we could get another recession and the rents would go down. Well, there's still money, huh?
Or an earthquake.
Right.
Well, Gale, it's been very nice talking to you. Congratulations on all your reportage. I hope you're able to get back out there on the streets real soon.
Thank you so much. I hope I can too.